Well, if I am audible, if, if I am audible, I mean, you're not audible to me, but I seem to be audible to you. So that's a bit of a problem because it seems to be a one-way communication. But all the same, well, thank you. Let me just start. And thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. It's always a bit of a problem if I don't know who the audience, I can't see the audience. But these technical glitches apart, let me talk at length at what I would what would interest you is that I want to talk about the very idea, the concept behind what is called Bharat Mata. And I'm speaking at a very exceptional moment today because in this country, and in fact in the rest of the world, we have suddenly, because of this COVID issue, because of the lockdown, because of the suspension of more or less all international traffic, suddenly have had to depend increasingly more and more on ourselves. The conventional wisdom which existed so far was that globalization was the new reality. But as things are moving, it would seem that globalization has taken an enormous knock. A knock which might actually transform the nature of the world itself. And we are back to talking about the nation state. We are back to talking about local communities. And the idea that in India, or in fact the rest of the world, has entered a post-national scenario seems to have taken a bit of a battering. This idea, of course, has not been welcomed by everybody. Because to them, where India stands today is in a very flawed environment, an environment which has been distorted. One of the big, what is called a public intellectual in India, a gentleman by the name of Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who a lot of you famous, one of the most erudite scholars in the social sciences. Recently, actually, not very recently, about 2 years ago, wrote an article which he called, and where he described India, what India is going through at present, as the age of cretinism. Now that's a very strong word, cretinism. And he wrote that there is no doubt that India is in a full-blown reactionary moment. It is hard to grasp the nature of this reaction because it wears the garb of deep democratic legitimacy. It is an admission of despair described as the politics of hope. All the attributes of a reactionary politics are now gathered in one coherent form. And one of the more recent examples of what might be called, what certain people are calling, the full-blown reactionary movement in India, was the appeal by the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, in the midst of this coronavirus crisis, when he said, as an expression of national solidarity, we should have, first he gave the call for a Janta curfew. Then he gave the call for what might be called a Thali Bajao moment, to as its culmination. And finally, he gave a call for everyone to light diyas in their homes. Because for him, it was an expression of solidarity. It was an expression of the creation of a national community. That, to a lot of people, have seemed very, very odd. It has been odd for them because in the past, when the Prime Minister has addressed rallies, he has begun often, and in fact most of the times, whenever there's a political rally, by invocation of Vande Mataram. And he has followed it up, or it's been preceded by chants of Bharat Mata ki Jai. Now, Bharat Mata ki Jai, or even Vande Mataram, today has acquired an enormous amount of popularity. Some of you who've been to cricket matches may have actually seen that Bharat Mata ki Jai is often used during cricket matches, especially during these one-day matches when there's a lot of feverish excitement and there's a lot of flag waving. And the flag waving is also accompanied by the chants of Bharat Mata ki Jai. At the Wagah border, where there is a very contrived display of mock aggression by both the Indian and Pakistani sides, and the troops go marching, with banging their feet, and there's a lot of pageantry and showmanship which is there. The Bharat Mata ki Jai is often used in the Indian side. Now, the question is, what is the concept? What is the idea behind Bharat Mata? And why do a lot of people take objection to it? Is it so repugnant an idea? Is it so distasteful an idea that people should take offense? And why does it inspire so many people to say it? I would begin by invoking a speech which the Prime Minister gave in the Lok Sabha on June 11th, 2014, shortly after he first came to power. And he said, and I am quoting in Hindi, 1200 साल की गुलामी का मानसिकता हमें परेशान कर रहा है. बहुत बार हमसे थोड़ा ऊंचा व्यक्ति मिले तो सर ऊंचा करके बात करना की हमारी ताकत नहीं होती है. And here he was talking about something, that why do Indians always feel so diffident about themselves, about their identity? Why do we feel we are inferior? And this is a common trait. Why often do we beg for foreign certificates? And this is the question which has been asked. But this is not a question which is only limited to the Prime Minister asking this question. From about the mid-19th century to about the latter part to the middle part of the 20th century, particularly when India was experiencing the great struggle for freedom, which was not merely a struggle for freedom, it was also a great emotional upsurge in India. The great Indian thinkers of that generation were preoccupied, and if you look through their writings and their speeches, you will find that despite all the other differences they may have had, they were addressing one particular question, which is, why did we lose our freedom? Why did we lose our sovereignty. Why is India unfree? Now the question, this was a question which a lot of them asked. The answers to this question may have differed. But what all of them were agreed on at one point was what the great Justice Bhandarkar, one of the greatest scholars of that time, who was Vice Chancellor of Bombay University at the turn of the century, often said India lacked a corporate identity. Now, what did this mean in actual practice? Now, I will take a few examples of what people meant and what people thought we should aspire towards. And this, mind you, is sort of from the late 19th century to about the mid 20th century we are talking about. When the question of what is today called the idea of India was actually being explored by these great intellectual stalwarts. Now let me start with Rabindranath Tagore. Each country, he said in a speech in Shantiniketan in September 1932, has its own inner geography where her spirit dwells and where physical force can never conquer even an inch of ground. He repeated this theme a week later when paying tributes to Mahatma Gandhi on his birthday, and he said, India is not merely a geographical entity, but is a living truth which they, that is the Indians, live, move and have their being. Now, why was he invoking this? The idea. What for him was an idea? That there was a great spiritual dimension which was there in India. Now, let me come to the second person who gave his analysis of the situation. And although he never formally participated in the political movements, but his influence in politics has been far more profound than those who actually were in politics. And I'm talking about Swami Vivekananda. And he said, and this is a slightly longish piece, which I'm going to quote. And he said, the problems in India are more complicated, more momentous than the problems in any other country. Race, religion, language, government, all these together make a nation. The one common ground that we have is our sacred tradition, our religion. That is the only common ground, and upon that we shall have to build. The unity in religion, therefore, is absolutely necessary as the first condition of the future of India. There must be the recognition of one religion throughout the length and breadth of this land. National union in India must be a gathering up of its scattered spiritual forces. A nation in India must be a union of those whose heart beats to the same spiritual tune. And I think it's that last sentence which is really relevant. A nation in India must be a union of those whose hearts beat to the same spiritual tune. In his own way, this is precisely what Rabindranath Tagore was talking about, that great impersonal feeling which existed in this country, which defined India. Others too spoke about it. Lokmanya Tilak spoke about it. Others have spoken about it too. That sometimes when you define what is Indian, you can't do it by merely talking about, are we talking about the same language? I mean, I speak Bangla, someone else may speak Tamil, someone else may speak Hindi. That's not the commonality. Even in terms of rituals, there's so much of a difference. There are commonalities too. So what binds it? It's how this intangible force brings together India and why this is so different from anywhere else. And this was recognized at that time. And this was the context in which the idea of Bharat Mata actually rose. The idea of Bharat Mata is not an ancient idea. That's the first thing I must tell you. It's in fact a modern creation. And its origin, in the manner in which we today understand it, goes back to 1875, when Bankim Chandra Chatterjee wrote penned the song Vande Mataram. He incorporated it into a novel in 1881, and Rabindranath Tagore, for the first time, gave a musical rendering of it at the session of the Indian National Congress in 1896. But that didn't capture the imagination per se. The gentleman who popularized it in more ways than one was actually Sri Aurobindo. He recognized for Vande Mataram for what it was. It was a mantra. It was a mantra which encapsulated all the ideas which we'd been struggling to give some form to. And he called it a sudden moment of awakening from long delusions. For him, the discovery of Vande Mataram was a sudden moment of awakening. And the imagery of Vande Mataram was also very, very important. And I think it's worth talking about the imagery of Vande Mataram. Now, most people today are only familiar with only the first and second verses of Vande Mataram. The reason being partly that the other verses have more or less been Baudelarized, is a word which they use in literature. It's been airbrushed out of the public imagination. It's been airbrushed out of the public imagination because it was thought to have been offensive to some people. But more important, it was thought to have been very aggressive in its tone. Vande Mataram is not a placid song. It is a militant song. And it was that militancy which actually inspired the people. It became the rallying cry, it became the mantra of the entire struggle against the British. It was a mantra which united those who believed in violence, who were the revolutionary nationalists, people like Bhagat Singh, etc. And it united them with the Gandhians, people who believed in complete non-violence. Now, take these one passage from Vande Mataram, and it's a song in Bangla, so I'll read it in Bangla and then I'll make an English translation for it. And here, Bankim writes, Shoptokoti konto kolonidadidi korale, Dishoptokoti bhujoi dhitokor korobale, Obola kenoma eto bolo, Bohubolo dharining, Nomining tarining, Ripudolo barining mataram. Now, what does it mean? Now, Aurobindo has done the most wonderful, poetic English translation of it. And it says, terrible with the clamorous shouts of 70 million throats and the sharpness of swords raised in twice 70 million hands. Who saith to thee, Mother, that thou art weak? Holder of multitudinous strength, I bow to her who saves, to her who drives from her armies of her foemen the mother. So let's look at it again. Who says, Mother, you are weak? You are so strong as to drive your foes from this. So that was the imagery. And just if you think that that was a sort of one-off imagery which defined Indian nationalism at that time, it wasn't. A lot of people cite Rabindranath Tagore as being the architect of the enlightened vision of India, contrasted with the non-enlightened vision of India, which others have, etc. But I'm just going to quote something from Rabindranath, one of his most famous songs. And he wrote it about Bengal. But it can be enlarged because the idea is very important. And I'm talking about how the idea of Bharat Mata was actually born. And let me first read it in Bangla and then I'll give an English translation. And in Bangla it says, Aji Bangladesher hridoy hote kokhon aponi, tumi ei অপরূপ রূপে বাহির হলে জননী, ওগো মা তোমায় দেখে দেখে আঁখি না ফিরে, তোমার দুয়ার আজি খুলে গেল সোনার মন্দিরে, ডান হাতে তোর খর্গ জলে, বাঁ হাতে করে শঙ্খহরণ, দুই নহনে স্নেহের হাসি, ললাট নেত্র আগুন বরণ. Now what does it mean? Translation, which this translation has been done by a very good historian, Sugata Bose, whose otherwise ideological proclivities might be very different. But here he writes, from the heart of Bangladesh, actually Bangladesh in those days meant Bengal. There was no such thing as Bangladesh as a separate entity. From the heart of Bangladesh spontaneously, you have emerged with such breathtaking beauty, Mother. In your right hand flashes the scimitar. In your left hand it dispels fear. Your two eyes radiate a loving smile. The third eye on your forehead is a fiery glow. So look at Bankim Chandra's talking about Tuham Durga Dashapraharani. You are like Durga. And look at it, how Tagore looks upon it. And you can look at it one thing. That here what we are seeing was the creation of an imagery of Bharat Mata, which was not something shy, demure, retreating, but it was an aggressive Bharat Mata, a Bharat Mata who would stand up for its own right. And this whole idea that Indian nationalism would become like this was actually put forward from that. Since then, a lot of people have made iconic depictions of Bharat Mata. In some places, like if you see in this book of mine, I put in one, which is a Bharat Mata, which is often used in calendar art. But there are often depictions of Bharat Mata. She's sitting on a lion with a spear in a hand, with a sword in another hand. So various depictions of Bharat Mata have been there all along. And this is what one of the greatest disciples of Swami Vivekananda was an Irish lady. We know her today as Sister Nivedita. She was arguably the most militant nationalist. She was so nationalist and so militant that even the Ramakrishna mission couldn't digest her, and she had to be put outside the fold of that. In describing the idea of nationhood in India, and implicitly of Bharat Mata, she wrote, and I think it's worth quoting this. Aggression in a chapter which is entitled Aggressive Hinduism. Aggression is to be the dominant characteristic of the India that is today in school and classroom. Aggression and the thought and ideals of aggression. Instead of passivity, activity. For the standard of weakness, the standard of strength. In place of a steadily yielding defense, the ringing cheer of the invading host. Merely to change the attitude of the mind in this way is already to accomplish a revolution. And this is what the whole notion is again boiling down. How the idea of nationhood is being given a modern shape. And one of the most important people who became the symbols of this modernity, the symbols of this, in a historical sort of way, was Chhatrapati Shivaji. Now, why was Chhatrapati Shivaji so important? How was Chhatrapati Shivaji perceived in terms of the nationhood which we created later? And I'll again go back to something which has been written. One of the most important historians who studied Shivaji was a gentleman called Sir Jadunath Sarkar. He's not very fashionable today because I think a lot of the Marxist historians don't seem to like what he said. Also, they don't like the fact that he relied excessively on documents, etc. But his interpretation of Shivaji was very... And this is what he says about Shivaji's contribution. And please try and link it up with the idea of nationhood, of how the idea of Bharat Mata increasingly takes shape. And he wrote, that is Shivaji, has proved that the Hindu race can still produce not only jamadars meaning non-commissioned officers in those days, those subordinate things, and chitnesses meaning clerks, but also rulers of men, and even a king of kings, the Chhatrapati. Emperor Jahangir cut the Akshay-Bath tree of Allahabad down to its roots and hammered a red-hot iron cauldron onto its stump. He flattered himself that he had killed it, but lo, within a year the tree began to grow again and pushed the heavy obstruction to its growth aside. Shivaji has shown that the tree of Hinduism is not really dead, that it can rise from beneath the seemingly crushing load of centuries of political bondage, exclusion from the administration, and legal repression. It can put forth new leaves and branches. It can again lift its head up to the sky. This is important because today we are often told that the idea of India is somehow so benign that we can be kicked around, that we must tolerate everything. That the idea of India which some of us have has no relationship with what is called the freedom movement. In this short discourse, it's a very brief, I've just touched only a few points. I've just tried to show what were the circumstances And what was the thought process by which Bharat Mata became the defining idea of India, and what it meant, and why this was inspired by Vande Mataram. And therefore, when we invoke Vande Mataram, when we invoke Bharat Mata ki Jai, we are actually bringing together the weight of an entire experience which grew out of this question: why did India why was India held in slavery for so long, and what can we do to rescue it and resurrect that spirit which Rabindranath Tagore talked about, which Swami Vivekananda spoke about, and which in its own way, passive way perhaps, Gandhiji also recognized. So, in this time of global epidemics, when there is a great deal of confusion about the future, there is a great deal of anxiety and uncertainty about the future, about where we are. It's often important to realize where we came from, that the modern India which has been created. Jawaharlal Nehru once spoke in his important Tryst with Destiny speak, said, "The soul of a nation long suppressed, trying to find expression." I like that thing. There are a lot of things about Jawaharlal Nehru I don't like, but I love that construction of his. The soul of a nation long suppressed, trying to find expression. And one of the methods, one of the means by which this expression was done was by invoking the idea of Bharat Mata. Thank you very much for patiently listening to what I had to say. I don't know, it's very difficult for me because I can't get any feedback from here to know whether it made any sense, what I had to say. So, thank you. Maybe if you ask questions and if you put it there, I'll be able to answer them in a sort of, it's a strange form of medium whereby your questions are coming to me silently and I'll have to answer them. Maybe we'll have about 5-10 minutes of questioning. I mean, these things don't go on for too long, so please. Well, I'll wait for another minute if there is no question. I mean, I know it's very difficult for people to type out complex questions. It's much easier said. But I think this particular medium has its own shortcomings. Someone has said, can you suggest a few readings? Well, I would suggest that if people actually go through some of the texts of at least Aurobindo, Swami Vivekananda, and Sister Nivedita, you don't have to go through all. These things are now available in more truncated form. His writings on India, and there were others which are on Vedanta and others, but I'm only going with that. That's a lovely starting point. I don't want to peddle my book, but in this book, Awakening Bharat Mata, which I compared, along with the long introduction, there is a long set of readings. And those readings basically will actually tell you why the worship of the country has become such an important part of India. But it's not only a thing of India. Now, someone has asked an interesting question. Can the Indian constitution be a substitute for a deity for modern India? I'm very glad this question has been asked. It's really one of those pressing questions of our times. When people say we swear by the constitution, our principal loyalty is to the constitution. Of course, they are right. But it also assumes one thing. Was India born in 1950? Was there an India which predated? If you say, I believe in the constitution as the last word, there is an assumption that there is nothing called India which predated the constitution. This, to my mind, is wrong. This, to my mind, is completely wrong. The constitution tells you an important thing. It defines the rules of the game. It defines how public life should be conducted. Just as when you play cricket, you have the laws of cricket. It tells you how. But it does not tell you about the nationhood of India, which predates the constitution, and which is really what Bharat Mata, which is what Vande Mataram, etc. So look upon the constitution as something which is very important, which is important in terms of upholding our democracy. But the idea of India is a far longer one. Now, basically, and someone has asked the question about what is the core spirit of being Indian, the difference from other nationalities. There are similarities, there are differences. The similarities are often quite apparent. A lot of other countries too have a defining figure. In France, there is a thing called Madeleine, which again sounds. Britannia itself is a feminine deity, but it doesn't have that same sort of thing. But there are sort of loose similarities. But I think where India is very, very different from a lot of people is, look at mainly European countries, where the spirit of unity is often born out of a language. Language is very important, and along with it comes certain a commonality of faith. Christianity is a very important part, whether it's Catholicism or even Protestantism. There's also a shared history to that extent. In India, one of the important things we note about India, that India never had, or very rarely in periods of history, was there a single state in India. We never had the same kingdoms. There was kingdoms here, kingdoms there, north, south, fractured kingdoms. And some people therefore have come to that conclusion, therefore on the basis of that, there never was an India. Because we didn't have a sense of political unity. But the sense of cultural unity was always there. Starting from the four dhams, which spans four corners of India, the pilgrimage routes. There is a term which a Harvard professor called Diana Eck has crafted, which is called the sacred geography of India. The sacred geography is another way of putting out this whole notion of the culture being very important in terms of things. Where language may be different, there are commonalities, of course. But this sense of togetherness is born out of what Vivekananda called beats to the same spiritual tune. You talked about India lacked a corporate identity. I was quoting Bhandarkar in this way. What Bhandarkar and a lot of people at that time spoke about, and here they were full of praise for the British. Not that the British actually ruled over us, but they say, look at the British as a people. They have such a strong sense of unity. They have a strong sense of common purpose. Whereas in India, we seem to think too much about caste, we seem to be broken about other things. Some of us fight about whether someone's a Vaishnavite, someone is a Shaivite. And that sense of common corporate unity, he said, had been lost at some point. And it was necessary to rekindle it. Today, if you look at it, there are some people who bring out this regional identity in one way. I think regional identity is very important. We all have our little regional identities. I feel very proud that I'm a Bengali. I have certain quirks and mannerisms, food habits, which are uniquely Bengali. But there are others who have other forms of things. This is not in India a point of departure. We can be competitive towards each other. We can often say that a masala dosa is better than your fish curry. That we can say that. Just as we play cricket, different Ranji teams, we have these IPL whereby the various forms, various city teams compete. Now that's part of life. But the more important thing is that in every moment of crisis, we have responded together as a common people. A people where difference doesn't matter. Look at the difference, look at the manner in which the whole country has responded, despite political differences, other differences, with probably one or two exceptions, to this entire coronavirus thing. The amount of difficulties borne by Indians does not in any way is in no way less, but it in fact 10 times more than those which the West is willing to endure. The West has seen devastating catastrophe, deaths, to the extent that they have more or less said that old people, people above 60, people with pre-existing health conditions are more or less dispensable. In India, we haven't said that. We said lives are more important. And here was India, where it used to be believed that human life is so cheap, we don't care. Now, someone has asked me a question about Gandhiji and Savarkar in a different way. Yes, I think there were a lot of very profound differences with Gandhiji and Savarkar. Both were undeniable patriots. That's the first thing we have to remember about it. That the patriotism of Gandhiji and the patriotism of Savarkar cannot be questioned. For them, Bharat Mata, the commitment to Bharat Mata was total. What they had in terms of differences was that Gandhiji, in my view, was a far better politician than Savarkar. Gandhiji knew how to mobilize, and Gandhiji knew the importance of symbolism far more effectively than Savarkar ever did. Savarkar in many ways was a theoretician. an intellectual. He created a thing with the idea of Hindutva, which he put forward. And the moment he went into the prescriptive, he got it wrong. Gandhiji, on the other hand, was more concerned, how do I persuade Indians who believe that they are weak because they lack arms, they don't have much resources, that they are actually very strong in the fight against British. And he turned that weakness into strength by saying that our strength is our numbers. And against these numbers, the force of British guns are pretty useless. And he demonstrated it. So the idea of bringing in mass politics into India, and in fact the global impact of that has been far-reaching. So I would look at it, and I'm giving a very brief answer. It's something which we can go on. It's something which can go on for a long time. This sort of debate about where Savarkar and Gandhi. I won't dwell into that because this is something which can go on endlessly. That's my sort of very preliminary. Someone has asked a question. As a student of history, I'm interested. Krishna Dange has asked. So, as a student of history, I'm interested in knowing why conservatism didn't gain ground in post-independence West Bengal. Well, I personally, now that's a question of what do you call conservatism? Conservatism in India has meant a few different things. One of the most important things it has meant is that the sense of a national community, that it's not the individual that is paramount, but that the individual is defined by the national community. That's one of the most important facets of a conservative. The other most important thing of a conservative, which is to be kept in mind, is that the conservative always believes that the weight of inherited tradition suggests a collective wisdom. That inherited wisdom is not prejudice, but is born out of the collective experience of many, many generations. And that must be taken over, nurtured, evolved, and added on. A radical, on the other hand, would say there must be a sharp rupture. I think what we saw in West Bengal is very twofold. On the face of it, we saw a very decisive intellectual break from the past. Why has Swami Vivekananda, for example, to take one example, been sanitized and made into something like a global guru who should have been best done in California? He's actually been, his context has been taken out, and there's a sort of contrived spiritualism which has been promoted. Why, for example, has the idea of history been so ridiculously secularized in West Bengal? You know, a generation ago, there were large numbers of young Bengali boys who were named Shivaji. Find me one person who's named Shivaji who were born after the 70s and 80s. It doesn't do. It's changed. The sensibilities have changed. And I think that's really where we have to go on the offensive. To attack the conventional politics in Bengal is more than a political struggle. It's actually a cultural battle as well. And it involves resurrecting community wisdom. It involves resurrecting the inheritance. And it has to be done carefully. And it also has to be done keeping in mind that today, half of Bengal is no longer in India. and that most of the people who were there, who stood for India in the parts that became Pakistan, have become refugees. And that's what the entire fuss over the CAA was, which we don't have to. Now let me take it's really, I've got another appointment at 7, just after 7. Now the question of secularism has been asked. Now this is a big debate. The debate was almost quite on the question of Vande Mataram. The recognition, Vande Mataram was the mantra and spirit of Indian independence. That was the song. There was no challenger to it. Right from 1905 to 1947, Vande Mataram, every Indian nationalist, whether they were Gandhians, whether they were something else, Tilakites, whether there were other more sort of militant and aggressive versions, they all swore by Vande Mataram. Yet, when it came to choosing the national anthem of India, our leadership decided against him, and as a sort of afterthought it was put in that, the Vande Mataram will be the national song and it will have the equal status as the national anthem. But over the years, a couple of things have happened. One is that Vande Mataram has been Baudelarized, the whole entire version has been, it's one thing not to sing it because it's a long song, but it's another thing to forget it, what it means, or to make sure that it's so embarrassing that it needn't be said in public. Secondly, it has been encouraged by a section of the community, particularly minorities, to say Vande Mataram doesn't belong to us. And I think this debate on secularism has some bearing on this. India has always been secular in the sense that we've always said that there are various ways in which people seek a spiritual salvation. There's no one way. We've never had this monopoly of a single route. What we did after 1976, when the term secularism was codified and brought in to the preamble of the Indian Constitution, was that we tried to define such a thing. Prior to 1976, you'd hardly find there were too many debates. Between 1950 and 1976, there were hardly any debates on what does secular mean and what does this mean. It meant, basically a good sort of good sense, tolerance, respect for everybody, and at the same time upholding your cultural values. It was only after 1976, when the term was put in, that you started to codify, and along with codification, you got into a fractiousness. And this, to my mind, was the biggest wrongdoing which Indira Gandhi did, is that she made it into a way which enabled some of the Marxists who believe that India must be defined in such a way so that the past and the essence of India is no longer there. There is a term called constitutional patriotism which is doing the rounds. This has some bearing on this. It's a belief which was propagated by some Germans after 1945, because they were embarrassed about what happened in Germany prior to 1945. They said, we'll make a new start, and the Germany will be defined by the adherence to the new constitution which comes after Hitler. We don't have anything to be embarrassed about. Our past is not a source of embarrassment to us. But it's been made into a source of embarrassment by those who believe that we should be defined, that our patriotism should not be defined in terms of Vande Mataram, it should not be defined in terms of Bharat Mata, but it should be defined exclusively is the word, in terms of what the rights and the rights which have been conferred by the Constitution. So, from a spiritual and emotional based commitment to India, Indian nationhood, we are trying to make it into a rights based and entitlement based belief in the Republic of India. I believe that Republic of India is very important. But its presiding deity was and will remain Bharat Mata. I thank you very much for the patience with which you've listened. Never mind the technical glitches. I wish next time I can speak where I can get some audio feedback. But thank you very much for all of you who had the patience to think. I'm sorry if I didn't answer all your questions, because again this scroll moves rather fast and I'm doing it out of a mobile phone. But thank you very much. Namaskar, and stay safe and be happy in whatever way you can amid the lockdown. Dhanyavad. Thank you.